Okay, last time I talked about the structure of social categories, applying theories of category structure that were originally developed in the non-social domain to the kinds of natural categories of persons that we encounter in the social domain. What I want to do today is to talk about a special kind of social category, and that is the stereotype, the social stereotype, which we can define following the work of David Hamilton, professor at UC Santa Barbara, as a conception that people have about the character of some group that's shared by members of an in-group, whatever that in-group happens to be, and generally applied towards members of an out-group. So the general idea is that whites have stereotypes of blacks, Christians have stereotypes about Muslims, Swedes have stereotypes about Finns, men have stereotypes about women, and the reverse. Women have stereotypes about men, Finns have stereotypes about Swedes, and so on. Whatever in-group you're in, what you generally do is apply a stereotype to some out-group. And these stereotypes have a number of different functions, that is, they have a number of different cognitive consequences, some of which are positive. These stereotypes perform a lot of the cognitive functions of any other category. They reduce the need for information, they reduce the need for information processing. You don't have to think too hard about what somebody's like once you've slotted them into a category. You can use the stereotype, which is essentially an assignment of category membership, to infer unobserved features. So if somebody says to me, I want you to meet my cousin, she'll be here in just a couple minutes, I know that cousin is a woman, I got a stereotype about women, I have something that I'm going to expect her, things that I'm going to expect her to be like. And also, in much the same way, once we've categorized a person, we can use that categorization to predict what they're going to do, both now and in the future, and for that matter, in the past. By the same token, stereotypes have relatively obvious negative cognitive consequences, which is that they can serve as a basis for emotional prejudice and outright discrimination. Stereotypes are usually negative stereotypes. Okay, there are examples of positive stereotypes, and there are mixes of positive and negative stereotypes. But in general, and especially the stereotypes that concern social psychologists, the stereotypes are negative, and they have negative consequences because they betray prejudice by in-group members toward out-group members, and they also serve as a kind of rationalization for discriminatory behavior by members of the in-group towards members of the out-group. Stereotype is a relatively new term. It was introduced by Walter Lippmann, an American journalist, in this general context as an oversimplified picture of the world, which of course is what any category is. It's an oversimplified picture of the world. But again, Hamilton made clear that a stereotype is a cognitive structure, and what stereotypes represent is the person's package of knowledge and expectations and beliefs that he or she has about some group of people, typically some out-group people. And these, over the years, Lippmann was not a psychologist, he was a journalist actually, and a political thinker, but it's very clear that you can take a number of different perspectives on stereotyping. We're going to emphasize only one of these in this course. For example, there's an economic perspective on stereotyping, which basically says that stereotyping serves the function of keeping outgroups in their place, in a one-down position with respect to some in-group. There is a slightly more benign variant on this, a kind of motivational perspective, that basically says that stereotypes result basically from the distinction that is fundamental, as Sumner pointed out, fundamental distinction between us and them. That stereotypes allow us to make clearly the distinction between our kind of people and that kind of person. What we're going to emphasize today is simply the cognitive functions of stereotyping. Because stereotypes are a kind of category, stereotyping is an almost inevitable consequence of categorization, almost an inevitable consequence of classifying a person as a member of some group. Again, to quote Lippmann referring to James here, stereotypes cognitively function as a simple model of the blooming, buzzing confusion of reality. So what do these stereotypes look like? Well, stereotypes usually consist of a bunch of features, as you might expect from, say, the classical theory of categories or the prototype theory of categories. And sometimes there is some reference to variability on these features. So you might have a stereotype that consists of some outgroup's presumed average standing on some characteristic, but also some sense of their variability. Or from an exemplar point of view, stereotypes consist of exemplary instances of some group of other people, and also some exceptions. There's a very interesting example of this in the 2008 presidential election, when Harry Reid was quoted of saying about Barack Obama that one of the reasons that Reid was in favor of Obama's candidacy for the presidency was that he believed that the country was ready to embrace a black presidential candidate, especially one such as Obama, a light-skinned African-American with no Negro dialect unless he wanted to have one, okay? So the idea here was one of the things that Harry Reid thought would make Obama acceptable and likable to a largely white population was that he didn't match the typical white stereotype of black people. So again, it's just a really dramatic example of how this kind of stereotyping can occur. As knowledge structures, as categories, stereotypes have two aspects to them that we want to keep separate. One is what you might call the inductive aspect. If you think about induction of general principles from specific instances, what happens in inductive stereotyping is that we attribute to an entire group of people the features that we encounter in a single instance. So whether it's a single woman becoming representative of women as a whole, a single Muslim becoming representative of Muslims as a whole, that would be the inductive aspect. But also there's this deductive aspect of stereotyping, which is that once you've got a stereotype, once you've got a set of features that you ascribe to a group as common to and characteristic of the members of that group, then what you're going to do naturally, more or less naturally, is to attribute to every instance of the group, every member of the group, all the features that are associated with the group as a whole. Now, when you really push people on what they mean when they engage with stereotypes, it probably doesn't mean that they think that the stereotypical features are true of all members of a group. But what they probably do mean is that either that these stereotypical features are true of most members of the group, or that they are somehow typical of group members. And we're going to see a little bit later on exactly what typical means in this context. First, let's go back to a classic study of stereotyping. This is a study by Katz and Braley, published in 1933, meaning the data was collected before 1933. It's a study of Princeton University students. At that time, Princeton University undergraduate population was all male and almost exclusively white upper class. This is the Princeton of F. Scott Fitzgerald. Okay, what Katz and Braley did was to initiate a series of studies that are now known in the literature as the Princeton Trilogy, because there were three of them, encompassing three different generations of Princeton University students. And what Katz and Braley did was to gather together a group of students, present them with a list of some 84 personality traits, and then present them also with the names of various social groups: Germans, Italians, Christians, Jews, Americans, whatever, and ask them simply to choose 5 traits that were characteristic of different ethnic groups. That's all Katz and Braley did. And what they discovered, I'll show you some of the actual results in a minute. What they discovered in 1933 was first that there was considerable agreement among these students about the characteristics of various groups of people. Considerable agreement about what Germans were like, about what Italians were like, and so on. And they also revealed a positive bias towards their own in-group. One of the social groups that the students were asked to rate was Americans. Okay, and it turned out that these students chose positive traits much more frequently with respect to Americans than they did with respect to other groups. This study was repeated. Note the date here. This study was repeated right after World War II, published in 1951 by a guy named Gilbert, who discerned less agreement among people in terms of their stereotypes of these the various groups. But more interestingly, in 1951, these individuals didn't like the task nearly as much as they had in 1933. Many of the students balked at the task. They disliked making various kinds of generalizations. But another big difference between the 1933 study and the 1951 study was that there emerged an extremely negative stereotype of Japanese, which Gilbert attributed to World War II. Okay, note 1933. This is before Hitler came to power in Germany. Okay, 1951. This is right after World War II. And then Carlins and his colleagues repeated the study, exactly the same procedure, exactly the same population, Princeton University students, in 1969. And here the students found the test even more objectionable. They really rebelled at this task. But one interesting feature of 1969 was that they still stereotyped. That is, they still had images of various social groupings. But overall, these images were a lot more positive, a lot more favorable in 1969 than they were in the earlier studies. And you can attribute some of this to the 60s, right? Very liberal at the time, the influence of the civil rights movement, and so on. I have more to say about this in a minute. Yeah. There was not, and that's interesting, isn't it? Yeah, it just wasn't as negative. Again, 1951, the war was over for both of them. But this shift in stereotype affected Germans and stereotypes of Germans and stereotypes of Japanese very, very differently. As you'll see in a minute, the stereotype of Germans became much more positive. Well, it actually stayed pretty positive, because it was pretty positive in 1933. Nobody knew anything about Adolf Hitler in 1933, at this time in 1933. And it just became much more negative. That had recovered by 1969, okay? But that's what it was in 51. Yeah. No, let's see. Princeton had not yet begun admitting female students, I believe. And besides, there's always a publication lag. So this data was probably collected about 1967. I can't remember offhand exactly when it was collected. But Princeton was just about the last Ivy League institution to integrate with respect to gender. So it was pretty late at this point. Yeah. Well, the stereotypes are culturally specific, but what the point of the Princeton Trilogy was, it's a Princeton culture, okay? Don't necessarily want to generalize to Americans as a whole, okay? This is kind of a convenient sample, and this is a problem with many psychological studies, was that we often fall into the trap of taking whatever college students happen to be available as representative of the population as a whole. You can get away with that in a place like Berkeley or a place like Cal State, the East Bay, where there is something more like a representative sample of the population here, obviously more highly educated, perhaps a little bit smarter. But Princeton was one of these highly selective, very expensive places, right? And it's almost certainly not representative of the population as a whole. I'll show you an example later of where people actually were able to get a representative sample of the population as a whole and do a couple of interesting studies. Let's just stick with this for a second. So here's the Katz and Braley study, and here are the traits that appeared most frequently in people's stereotype of Americans, and the traits that appeared most frequently in their stereotype of Germans. And if you look at this list, it's a pretty positive list, okay? There's nothing there would say, oh, I don't want to be that. Maybe Stalin. I don't know. Stalin's not a bad thing. But that's what that list was like. When by the time we got to 1969, here's the list from 1933. Some of the traits that appeared in 1933 dropped out of the list: jovial, musical, persistent, and practical. And some traits went in 1967. That's okay. So there's the answer. The data was collected in 1967. I'd forgotten that. Aggressive and arrogant and ambitious kind of went into the list, but there's still a considerable overlap over this 40-odd year period. Okay, so that's just evidence of the stability of these social stereotypes. Okay, but again, if you look at the Princeton Trilogy over a period of years, of the 40 years, you see a couple of trends that are quite interesting. The first is a general fading of negative stereotypes. Yes, there was that blip for the Japanese stereotype in 1951, but it had disappeared by 1967, 1969. There was also considerable less consistency across subjects in their stereotype. Each individual might have had some idea about what Italians or Germans were like, but it wasn't as widely shared in 1967 as it had been in 1933. And overall, it appeared to be the case that there was less negative valence associated with these stereotypes. And that was basically the way the stability of stereotyping was thought about at the end of the Princeton Trilogy of studies. There have been a couple of studies like this done since then, but they didn't involve the Princeton students. Nevertheless, there are some problems with these very, very, very well-known classic studies, problems that were uncovered mostly by Trish Devine and Andy Elliott. The first was, most important, the instructions to the subjects in the follow-ups to the Katz and Braley study were really ambiguous. Katz and Braley were pretty clear about what they meant by a stereotype. But in the later studies, the instructions were modified somewhat so that they didn't really clearly distinguish anymore between people's knowledge of a cultural stereotype and what their personal beliefs were. So when, by the time we got to 1969, we have people saying Germans are industrious and scientifically minded and arrogant and ambitious. We don't anymore know whether what the subjects are saying is people generally believe this about Germans, or whether they were saying I believe this about Germans. Okay, that distinction between knowing what a stereotype is and believing it to be true yourself is a fundamental distinction that will come up against a little bit later. The second problem, at least from Devine and Elliott's point of view, was that there was no assessment of the subject's own levels of prejudice. Again, especially in the latter two studies, there was this ambiguity about exactly what the ratings meant. And then finally, there was kind of an outdated adjective set. Devine and Elliott tried to correct these problems in a study of stereotyping based on Devine's own emerging theory about stereotypes. She's now a very important figure in this field. And the first is, her first point was to say, look, stereotypes are not the same as personal beliefs. You can know what a stereotype is, but reject it yourself. She argued that, again, that stereotypes are simply cultural associations of various kinds of features and attributes with some group label. You acquire these through socialization process. You've got to be carefully taught about these other kinds of things. And then these stereotypes are automatically activated, Devine argued, by the appearance in the environment of some group measure. So as soon as you see some member of an outgroup, you automatically activate the stereotype, but that does not necessarily represent your own personal belief. Rather, beliefs Devine defined as propositions that are accepted as true, and she said, look, these personal beliefs are not necessarily congruent with the stereotypes that we know, in large part because although stereotypes are automatically activated, she thought, we can still control expressions of prejudice by saying, well, okay, people believe this in general, but I don't believe it. I'm not going to act this way. So this distinction between stereotypes and beliefs then leads to a classification of people with respect to prejudice. With high levels of prejudice, we have people whose beliefs are congruent with prevailing cultural stereotypes. With low prejudice individuals, their beliefs are incongruent with prevailing stereotypes. They went on to study this with respect to the African American stereotype, that is the stereotype that white Americans hold about African Americans. Is a popular subject for a study in social psychology, especially since the civil rights movement. She developed a list of a set of 93 trait adjectives, most of which were taken from Katz and Braley, also updated by a couple of new features, and performed a kind of dual assessment. She asked the subjects to indicate whether a particular trait was part of the white stereotype of African Americans, and then she asked the same subjects to indicate whether they personally believed that a particular trait was characteristic of African Americans. And then the subjects also completed an attitude survey embedded in which was what's known as the modern racism scale. You can't get white people anymore to acknowledge genuinely racist beliefs, not too often anyway. But the modern racism scale is a scale that's intended to be a kind of more surreptitious measure of racial prejudice. I'm not a big fan of the modern racism scale, but I don't want to go into that right now. I'm trying to present this study to you. So one of the things that Devine and Elliott discovered when they compared their results, data collected at the University of Wisconsin, which is a very largely white institution, just because Wisconsin's a very largely white state, with the 3 studies of the Princeton Trilogy. On this scale, uniformity, low values indicate high uniformity among subjects in their beliefs. And one of the things that had appeared with the study of the Princeton Trilogy, as I said before, is that there seemed to be less consensus in the later studies about what the stereotypes of various groups are. What Devine and Elliott showed was that when you distinguish between stereotypes and personal beliefs, the level of uniformity was virtually the same in 1995 as it was in 1933. That is, uniformity of the stereotype. Okay, people knew what the cultural stereotype was of this group, and that level was pretty much the same. Here, we're looking at the favorability of this is the African American stereotype, highly unfavorable in 1933. These are white upper class Princeton students, after all. Diminished somewhat by 1951. Here in 1969, the African American stereotype is actually a little bit favorable. Okay, became more favorable in a study by Jack DeVideo in 1982. But again, these studies did not distinguish carefully between knowledge of the stereotype and personal belief. And when you did that very clearly, what it showed was that the stereotype, not the belief, but the stereotype remained as negative in 1995 as it was in 1993. Here you get another interesting finding here. You've got favorability, low favorability. This is below 0. Here we have above 0. And you've got subjects classified by prejudice level according to their scores on this modern racism scale. If you look at the stereotype, knowledge of the favorability of the stereotype, both low and high prejudice subjects have to understand that the stereotype is negative. Okay, but when you look at low prejudice subjects, their beliefs are actually in the positive direction. If you look at highly prejudiced subjects, their beliefs remain in the negative direction. A very nice demonstration of the difference between stereotype and personal belief, a very nice demonstration of the classification of prejudice based on congruence between stereotype and belief. So again, we got now stereotype is one kind of knowledge structure, a personal belief is another kind of knowledge structure, and they're different. Okay, that's an important point that comes out of these Devine studies. Okay, so just as in the Katz and Braley study, stereotypes are coherent. That is, they're a package that makes sense. They're consistent. They represent widely shared patterns of knowledge and belief. And although their precise content changes over time, stereotypes are overwhelmingly negative in nature. But again, people's personal beliefs may be quite different. It's one thing to know what a stereotype is. It's another thing entirely to endorse that stereotype personally. Okay, so that's the first point. Now let's talk about where these stereotypes come from. What does it mean when we say that the typical German is industrious, or the typical woman is kind-hearted, or whatever the stereotype we might have to say? This is an analysis that comes from Macaulay and Stitt, a classic paper on the meaning of the word typical, in performing a kind of Bayesian analysis. And Bayesian analyses are based on conditional probabilities. And what they did was to ask people to go through the Katz and Braley checklist. This was for the German stereotype, and indicate how likely it was that people had a particular trait in general, and then how likely it was that people would have